Good afternoon, Professor Neeson. This is my video presentation of my research paper. The research that has been conducted for this written assignment has been completed for the purpose of exploring evidence and its importance in the criminal justice field. My project will determine what evidence consists of, how evidence should be collected, maintained, and how it will be admissible in court. I'll also be talking about special privileges in court as well. During a trial, the details about a crime that the jury may see or hear may prove important in determining the outcome of a criminal case. Evidence consists of the details that were gathered from the crime scene for the purpose of the jury to make the most accurate decision possible. An additional purpose of evidence is to prevent individuals from being wrongly convicted due to the faulty memory of a witness. Law officials may be led astray if they are presented with bad or tampered evidence. In order to prevent that, it is important that law enforcement officials maintain the chain of custody. In order to maintain the chain of custody, they have to make sure that the evidence is properly collected, packaged, and labeled. When marking a bag that contains evidence, it's important that the individual handling the item includes the date and time, location, and what the item is. It is important that when evidence is discovered by a crime scene investigator, that it is carefully collected and preserved to be further analyzed, as it may be the possible link that can solve the case. Physical evidence can come in the form of a large object from, let's say, a car door, to a small object like fibers on clothing. When collecting physical evidence, it is important to conduct a full sweep of the crime scene by roping off a large area. This is in order to prevent items from being lost. You start off large and then you go smaller. The types of items that investigators would find at a crime scene should be handled and packaged depending on what the physical item is. Clothing items should be carefully wrapped separately to prevent any trace evidence from being lost. After the crime scene has been thoroughly analyzed by investigators, photographs should be taken. You should do a large, far away photograph, a mid-range photograph, and a close-up photograph as well. The crime scene should be vacuumed by a specialized vacuum cleaner in order to collect any sweepings that may have been lost or looked over during the investigation. The handling of evidence must be done with such care as to prevent any change from occurring from the time it's been collected to the time of being analyzed in a crime lab. If any item is not properly handled, say breakage or contamination occurs or evaporation, it will compromise the credibility of the evidence and could break the possible link of the case. It's also important when collecting evidence to use latex gloves and to use forceps to collect small trace evidence. All other equipment that isn't disposable, is important to properly sanitize it. Large items should all be sent in. Cinder blocks that may have blood on them, it's important to scrape them off. Transfer blood stains from t-shirts using swabs. Materials that may be used on a crime scene to collect evidence will include forceps, plastic pill bottles, swabs, envelopes, boxes, sealable plastic bags. Moistened swabs are generally used to collect dry blood samples without compromising the evidence. A small envelope or druggist fold can be used to store small samples of trace evidence to keep them from falling out. Boxes are used for guns and bullets to keep them in the original condition that they were found. It's also important to package biological materials such as bloodstained garments in a disposable packaging in order to prevent moisture from compromising evidence. Biological materials are very infectious, so it's important to follow the proper procedures and guidelines when handling these items. Evidence can be placed into 4 different categories that include witness testimonies, physical evidence, documents, and demonstrative evidence. Witness testimonies play an important role during the trial process by providing the jury with a first-hand account into what occurred with the intent of arriving at the truth. In order for an individual to be considered a competent witness, they must have personal knowledge of the facts of the case and also be obliged to tell the truth. They must also take an oath to testify truthfully. Written documents that are provided as evidence may serve the purpose of proving the accused was the source of the document. The document may be analyzed for handwriting and typewriting in order to prove the authenticity of the evidence. It's also possible to examine documents for modification, burn marks, erasures, things like that. Direct evidence is the testimony from a person who claims to have actual knowledge of the case or has an eyewitness to what happened during the crime scene. It is possible for the jury to determine that the witness is providing the direct evidence is sufficient enough to accept their point of view as a fact. Circumstantial evidence is indirect and serves the purpose of establishing another set of facts about the case and to help strengthen or bolster the case. When evidence is relevant, if it passes the balancing test and is competent, it is then considered admissible in court. The evidence must be connected to the case in a way that may provide the jury with a clear picture of the circumstances, and it must not lead law enforcement officials astray. It must not create side issues, things of that nature. A balancing test is used to determine whether the provided evidence is relevant or should be excluded from the record. The Federal Rules of Evidence 403 sets the standard by which evidence is weighed and determines if the evidence adds substantial value to the case and avoids being prejudiced. The evidence that passes the Fry standard may be considered admissible in court because they pass the scientific guidelines that are used to determine if the provided evidence is factual. Evidence would be considered inadmissible in court if the evidence in question is seen as irrelevant to the case or may provide side issues. If the evidence that is provided is inflammatory in the minds of the jury, for example, a gruesome photo or videos, that may offend the jury, it may be considered inadmissible in court. Privileged information in regards to evidence serves the purpose of protecting that confidence that exists within certain relationships. If a privileged communication exists in a certain situation, then the information that may come from it is subject to being protected under the public policy in the United States. Even though privileges act to prevent the full disclosure of all the evidence there is to gain, the legal system recognizes the privileged relationship over the ability to access all information. Examples of privileged relationships may include husband and wife, parent and child, attorney and client. These privileged relationships may be recognized depending on the state that the relationship exists in, because they are maybe incentive for one of the parties to be untruthful. A privilege is usually held by two people but may be granted to multiple people in the event that more than two individuals were involved in the private conversation, such as the case if a married couple went to consult an accountant. A privilege may be waived by the holder of the privilege, which may be done by consenting to the disclosure of the communication and without any type of coercion. When a privilege is waived that involves multiple parties, it is possible that the privilege that is being waived only affects the individual and not the other individuals by which the privilege still stands for. The husband and wife privilege is seen as the cornerstone of American society because it symbolizes privacy within that marital relationship. The two privileges granted in a husband-wife privilege is a witness disqualification and a communications privilege. Any information that is gained during the marriage is protected under the husband-wife privilege. However, when the marriage ends in divorce or annulment, any information that may be gained from before the marriage may be used. An admission is any statement or act that can be used as evidence by the opposing party as long as it's relevant to the case and doesn't violate their constitutional rights. As long as the admission was made without violating Miranda rights or the Sixth Amendment, it may be used as evidence during a trial. A confession differs from an admission because A confession is an acknowledgement of guilt in committing an act. It's important when securing admissions or confessions that any constitutional right must be respected and that any confession that was gained must be done voluntarily without any coercion. An admission may be an acknowledgement of being at the location of the crime scene or knowing the victim of the crime. Denial of being at the crime scene may also be used as an admission in the case that the arresting officer and the accused have conflicting stories, which may constitute as a false denial. An act may also constitute as an admission against the accused, such as hiding evidence or trying to escape the scene. If the accused is caught attempting to flee the scene, they will appear to have a consciousness of guilt, and a strong case can be built against them. Silence by the accused may also work against them in certain circumstances, which may be recognized as an admission. If the accused remains silent under circumstances where a reasonable person and a guilt-free person would respond, it may be seen as an implication of guilt. Basically, a lack of information from the accused can be seen as an implication of guilt, as long as a reasonable person would be willing to cooperate. What must be considered when dealing with confessions from the opposing party is the many rules pertaining to securing a confession and its storied history through Supreme Court decisions, which brings a court system to its current state. Throughout history, confessions have been used to convict many individuals that have chosen to acknowledge their guilt. However, there have been instances where coercive tactics were used by law enforcement officials in order to force a confession from the accused. Due to the use of coercion to obtain confessions from the accused, rules and requirements have been put into place in order to maintain that any confession that is gained was done so voluntarily. In order for a confession to be considered to be done voluntarily, there must be no signs of physical abuse, threat of violence, or promise of reward. The confession must be done with the accused having a complete mental freedom without any type of outside pressure or interference. Coercive tactics that may be used by law enforcement officials may include denying the accused a bathroom break, food, or rest. The process of introducing a confession requires that it is announced through a testimony by the securing officer. If the defense happens to object to the confession, then the judge must go through the procedure of making sure the confession was admissible by ensuring that it did not violate the defendant's right to due process, Miranda rights, or Fourth Amendment rights. When the judge analyzes the confession and finds that it was made voluntarily and free of coercion, then the judge can introduce it as evidence for the jury to dissect. A videotape confession is recommended because it is visual aid that can show the jury that it was voluntary. Also, any confession that is written on paper or any type of correction should be done by the accused. This is to prove authenticity.